If you take it down to the second district where the CNU poll had it, right, and this was obviously 2 weeks ago, the economy was still high, 30-odd%. Abortion ticked up to about 17%, right? And then kind of elections and electoral reform, I think, was about 14%, right? So those issues were a little bit more magnified in the second district, but still, the economy mattered most, right? And
because you feel that every day. You're going to fill up your gas once a week. You're going to the grocery store probably once or twice a week, and you're really seeing it. And also just with other general issues of the economy, also crime too. We haven't really talked about crime at all.
I think like
the perceptions there.
If you want to dive deeper into kind of the Gallup data, right, to understand, you know, kind of like impact of crime, impact of these, there was another question they always ask, which is, which political party do you think is best equipped or will do a better job to handle your important problem, your most important problem? So it doesn't matter if it's, you know, the economy or if it's elections or whatever, which party is most important for you? And this, again, Gallup, we're talking kind of averages across the country, 48% said Republicans to 41% Democrats.
Without naming a specific problem.
Without a specific problem or a specific candidate, right? So it's your most important problem. You're looking and seeing, you know, basically 2 out of 4 voters saying it's the Republicans that can handle this.
And from that, can you deduce that crime, the economy, energy, all those things that tend to be Republican-led issues are the most important things to the general voter?
Very much so. I mean, especially going into this election cycle. Number one, you know, I keep saying all tonight, it's the economy, stupid, right? You know, it's that old,
James Carville, right?
Exactly.
That's what he said that in 1992.
That wonderful old quote, but it's so true. And there's been a lot of research done into kind of elements of the economy, right? So we've looked historically, like how does inflation impact, you know, things like Senate elections versus House elections? And inflation's tricky because it's such a microcosm type issue, or macro issue. Yeah. And there's so many things going into it, but who do you blame, right, for it? And how do we understand it? And we're at a point in time where we know moving forward the last 2 years, we had this big significant effect where people then, with COVID, were looking at their pocketbooks. We saw people losing their jobs. We saw the economy tank, right? So there was such a focus on this that people are getting a much better idea of how inflation's impacting them. They're seeing gas prices going up. They're seeing food go up. Rent has gone up, right? All of these things have very tangible implications and for a significant period of time, and doesn't look like it's going to be getting better in the near future.
Let's go back a little bit when we talk about the Biden presidency, for example. After Donald Trump, we had January 6th. You know, Biden got elected, was supposed to be the person who was going to unite this very, very divided country, and he did win the election, and he came in, and in 2 years we have a conversation now where Republicans, if these trends continue tonight, are going to have a really, really big night, and the president's approval numbers are down 40% or below, depending which poll you look at. How did this happen so quickly?
Well, I mean, so there's a historical side to this, right? You know,
there is, correct,
right.
with the midterms, yes.
We typically understand that presidents in power will lose seats in the midterm election, right? You know, and it's 30-odd seats on average, right? And, you know, there's a couple that have bucked the trend. You know, we think back to the first midterm post 9/11, right? Bush did well, right? But historically, presidents are fighting this kind of this counter wind to try to. They've burned through their political capital in their first 2 years. They're the buck stops with them, right? You know, we can attribute things back to them.
Just got a bulletin.
Oh.
Ron DeSantis.
Yes.
The Associated Press has called that election for Ron DeSantis. He is the governor of Florida. He retains the governorship of Florida. And that didn't take long. No.
I mean, we saw kind of he's had several things kind of working for him recently. Most importantly, Hurricane Ian. Right? I mean, when hurricanes strike, natural disasters happen, we look to that point person for the state, a governor. And in this instance, Governor DeSantis had effectively officials on the ground, resources ready to move, emergency declarations signed and ready, and he did exactly what a governor is expected to do in that. So he's receiving essentially kind of a lot of that push into the final weeks of the election. And the question is ultimately going to come down to how big is he going to win by tonight, right?
Yeah, that will be, and because you have the former president rumored to be, or supposedly will be declaring in 2024 he's going to run. turning his sights on who? Ron DeSantis.
Right. So it's...
Maybe that's the guy to beat in the Republican Party for the nomination for 2024?
Well, you had former President Trump just this morning, it was kind of in the news, saying that he has a big announcement planned for the 15th.
Right.
And there's, everybody can jump to the conclusion and say, okay, he's, it's not that he's opening another casino, it's he's going to be running, he's running for the presidency. So we have to think about how this works in play with DeSantis, who is considered a front runner for the 2024 presidential election. So Donald Trump's obviously watching very closely tonight. He was asked about this, right? Who did you vote for today? And he said, yes, I voted for, for Governor DeSantis, right? And I wish him well on the night.
Matter of fact, we had an exclusive interview with Donald Trump through News Nation, Nexstar's News Nation, Marky Martin, to one of the questions. Donald Trump responded about how Republicans would do tonight. He said, well, I think that if they win, I should get all the credit, and if they lose, I should not be blamed at all. That's classic Donald Trump.
Typical Trump within kind of his MO, but I mean, it's something that's worked for him in the past, right? Depending on, kind of the various elections, right? And we've seen this kind of play out for candidates which he's endorsed in the past, right? If they win, it's because he endorsed them. He was kind of that kingmaker effect, right? And if they lost, well, they were a bad candidate, or there was something else in the race that, kind of that led them into that. And maybe you can make the same argument for Ron DeSantis himself, right? Was Trump the kingmaker for Ron DeSantis initially? It's debatable, but he might want to take credit for it tonight. However, if there is this kind of meteoric win for Governor DeSantis, what does that do for his 2024 prospects? And then what does that do for Donald Trump looking in and saying, ooh, can I let Governor DeSantis keep running high this quick off this, or do I need to do something to blunt that within the next 24 hours, or do I wait till the 15th?
Does Donald Trump, knowing what kind of mercurial personality he has, and how he is usually the center of attention when he comes into a room or any kind of arena, he and DeSantis go at it, knock each other out, and I remember you brought this point up, then who rises to the occasion for the Republican Party?
Right, so if we do have this scenario of these two juggernauts essentially entering into mutually assured destruction, right, they take each other out, there's potential that somebody like Glenn Youngkin could essentially ascend through. If we go back to just a year ago, literally, we're 12 hours away from when this happened, was within kind of the conservative news sphere. Governor Youngkin was already donned as a rising star. There was talk of 2024 aspirations, right? And especially since Virginia, we're an interesting state, right? We're the only state in the country where our governors get one term for 4 years. Right, and then obviously they can cool off, right, and then come back at it, but historically they don't, with the exception of like Terry McAuliffe. But there was a lot of talk that Glenn Youngkin, we're on our off-year election cycles, right? So he's not up again. He doesn't have to worry about if he's running for the president, it's going to impact the state legislature, the Republican Party in the state legislature. So he may run in 2024. And where have we seen him? We've seen him all around the country leading up to this election cycle. Stuff in Arizona and Georgia and Michigan.
In a short amount of time, he was everywhere. Yeah.
I mean, it was kind of a 2-week period. He was blitzing around the country, right? And that leads to, when you think about these are rising stars, these are people at the top of the food chain, and if they're kitchen table names, right?
Yeah.
Before Glenn Youngkin won in 2021, you ask a Republican across the country, do you know who this Glenn Youngkin fellow is? Nobody would know. But in the year post that, Glenn Youngkin is now a Republican kitchen table name, and when you're doing something like running for the presidency, and you have essentially a blueprint that helped you to win a state like Virginia, that's something. A
difficult state to win, especially at that time.
Yes.
Let's stay in Virginia for a moment, because we were talking about the 2nd District, and our latest numbers now, we're going to keep track of the 2nd District race. Of course, Kiggins is still ahead, according to the numbers we have here from
BPAP.
BPAP, okay, terrific. I'm getting a bulletin here. Bobby Scott has just won over Terry Namkung. That's in the 3rd District, and a sizable margin. And Ben, this is no real surprise, is it?
No, I mean, this is one that kind of the joke, before this was.
Safe seat.
Yeah, it was a safe seat. It might have been a, who could jump to, the button fastest to declare victory here, News Network wise. But this was very much a safe seat, one for Bobby Scott, and frankly, not a lot of actual kind of campaign fundraising really being done in the third, right? It was kind of just expected.
Well, let's go. I was talking about the 2nd District, and then we also discussed the 7th District. Now, what about the 10th? How is that shaping up? Because I remember you saying 2nd District, 7th District, 10th District will determine the degree to which Republicans have, the night they're going to have.
Yeah, so if we look at the 7th District right now, and this is according to VPAP, 74% of the vote is in, so a large chunk, even from when we just started broadcasting about 15 minutes ago, right? So 74% of the vote is in, 54.5% is against Spanberger. So Vega is picking up 54% of the vote, 54.5, compared to 45.29.
Wow, so how many precincts are in there?
Oops, wrong vote.
Oh, that's okay.
Where are we at? So with 142 out of 193 precincts reporting.
Okay.
So I mean that's
wow.
Yeah, I mean that's big, right? For Spanberger to essentially be down by 9 points with still a quarter of the vote outstanding, right?
Right.
However, of the early votes that are reported, only 37.4% are in. So don't go running to the bank with this saying,
No, we have to be very careful how we. That's
right.
why I don't want to jump to conclusions.
No, and this is what we we think about the last several election cycles, right? There's a fear of what we call a red mirage or a blue mirage, right? It's that there still is a lot of votes still kind of hanging out there, right? And about 50,000 votes of early votes that are still hanging out there. But, and again, Vega's leading by 16,000 votes. That could evaporate very quickly depending, when these kind of early votes come in, depending who's voting in them, where they're coming from.
Just have to keep a close eye on it.
Yeah.
Let's go to the 10th District really quick and just see how that's coming along.
The 10th District is an interesting one for, from a perspective of forecasting what we'll think will happen on election night, right? So the 10th District, post-redistricting, it's a Democratic stronghold, right? Before redistricting, it was a +12 Democrat stronghold, and now it's a +10 Democratic stronghold. So still sizable in favor of the Democrats. However, leading into the election, right, between Wexton and Cowell, the polls narrowed, right? So there was very minor polling being done in this race, of course, right, because it's such a Democratic stronghold. But at least the one poll was showing, a 43 to 42 percent race, right? So 2 points between the two, so margin of error, et cetera. However, where we're at kind of right now with 63% of the vote in, Wexton is ahead with 51.65% compared to Cal of 48.29. That's very close.
Wow, that is.
For a Democratic stronghold. So that's giving us indications for how the night more generally is potentially going for Republicans across the country, right? As I've said before, the second is a good barometer for if Kiggins beats Loria, that's all right. It was redistricting changes.
Right. A strong Republican district, now 6 points.
Exactly, right? So that's showing, okay, Republicans are having a good night. If the 7th goes to Vega over Spanberger, that's a really good night for Republicans. And then if the 10th goes, then that's something to really take a pause and say, whoa, what happened here?
Wow. We've got a couple more minutes left in this segment because we're going to take a little break coming up in about 2 or 3 minutes. But if you're in the Democratic Party, what do you do if you have this night? Suppose Republicans take the House, they take the Senate, they have majorities now. What is the strategy of the Democrats at that point?
It's messaging, right? It's trying to understand in kind of the post-mortem of the election, where did your messaging fail, right? What were the issues that resonated with voters? And then, you look to see, all right, did we miss the message, right? Did we package it wrong? How did the Republicans package it better than we did? So you focus group it out, you test the message, you look to see in the competitive seats where perhaps you had some Democrats actually win, right? So you look to those races. What did they do right that we in other states did wrong, right? So it's a quick turnaround. I mean, you got 2 years until we hit 2024, and we think ahead forward. All right, which candidate recruitment, messaging, fundraising, of course.
What about policy?
And this is
legislative policy.
And this is where Virginia might actually form kind of a backbone for legislative policy as well as for campaigns moving forward, right? We look at the issues, in particular, the 10th district in Northern Virginia is fascinating, right? This was a district or an area of the state where Youngkin effectively picked up, right? I mean, you know,
Right.
he did well in this area, better than he expected. But he ran on issues that resonated with those voters. Issues about children, education, parental responsibilities and roles in the classroom, what is being taught, right? These are kind of issues that it doesn't matter who you are, right? They resonate, especially when you talk about children. It tugs at those heartstrings, right?
I got one more bulletin here.
Yep.
Another Republican victory tonight from Florida. Marco Rubio will retain his Senate seat. And David, that's from the Associated Press? The Associated Press just called that race, and Val Demings, I believe, was the Democratic opponent, former police chief of Orlando.
Yep.
I interviewed her many times down there.
Yeah, it was a fascinating race. We saw kind of the polls narrow a couple of weeks ago, and then Marco Rubio started to kind of pull ahead again, right? And this is one where it's most likely not going to be as big of a victory as DeSantis is most likely going to have. But for the Republicans in the Senate, this is a seat you had to hold. And walking away from this, it's going to be interesting to dig into a lot of this precinct data to see where did Rubio win and where did DeSantis win. I mean, Miami-Dade, right? You know, it's like potentially, you know, this is a place that could, if Governor DeSantis wins that, that'll be the first Republican to win that in 20 years, right? But then look, where did Rubio do? Did he track well in those same areas? Did he not? Was it kind of a tale of two candidates here, but they still have the same outcome? This is where it's going to get fascinating to really dig in.
Those are all very good questions. We have so much more to talk about here on our online version of our election headquarters. I'm here with Dr. Ben Molesky, who is a political science professor at Old Dominion University. You always see him here on WAVY TV as one of our political analysts, an expert analyst, and does a wonderful job breaking down the numbers and what these things all mean to us on election night. We're going to come back in about 5 minutes and continue this discussion online, but for now, we're going to take this short break.
Good evening. I'm Maria Elena Boloris. Welcome to our continuing coverage of election night here in Hampton Roads. We have a lot to cover tonight. First off, the AP projects that Bobby Scott will serve another term in the 3rd congressional seat. Now to the biggest race of the night, the race for 2nd District in the House of Representatives. With about 17% of the votes in, Republican challenger Jen Kiggins is currently leading by 16,866 votes over Democratic incumbent Elaine Luria. Again, only 17% in right now, so lots of time and many more votes to be counted. Down on your side's Chris Horn is with the Luria campaign in Virginia Beach. So, Chris, how are things going so far over there?
Yeah, I would say, Lena, that it's a room filled with muted optimism. However, if those numbers hold that you just mentioned, I don't know that that optimism is going to be rewarded. It's about a 58 to 42 split right now. It is still early. Of course, Elaine Luria, 2-term incumbent, trying to overcome sort of the albatross around her neck, that being the Biden administration and its low approval ratings. And nationwide, the Democrats seem to emphasize the Roe versus Wade reversal, abortion rights, as well as the potential loss of democracy and the change in the American way of life, rather than emphasizing the economy. The economy's stupid once again. But Elaine Luria is trying to overcome all of that. She said that she has a record that she can stand on. She's done a lot for the military. That's something that people in Hampton Roads can, of course, relate to, she being a retired Navy commander herself. So they're just watching and waiting here, hoping that the numbers reverse, and Lena, perhaps that Elaine Luria will gain a 3rd term. We're live in Virginia Beach. Lena, back to you.
Chris, thank you. Let's switch now to 10 on your side's Andy Fox. He is live in Virginia Beach Town Center with the Jen Kiggins campaign. Andy, what can you tell us from there?
Well, I can tell you it's really loud. You know, it's really quiet where Chris is, and it's getting really loud here. There is great enthusiasm here that this is going to be a Jen Kiggins victory. She comes into this really as not the underdog. She's in a +6 Republican district, and it really has, we're seeing it in the early numbers coming back, you know, 14, 15, 16,000 votes. I was with Jen Kiggins. I was with Elaine Luria yesterday, and when I was conducting the interview, she said, well, it's been a good ride. And she said that, and it kind of, I stopped, you know, as if she knew something. But she, you know, quickly said that no matter what happens, she's done the best she can. And number 2, if she loses, it likely was because of the Republican makeup of the district. But everyone here is really excited, getting ready, and we will have more coming up for you later. In Virginia Beach, Andy Fox, 10 on your side.
Andy, thank you. Our live local coverage continues in just a moment over on WAVY.com. That goes through 9:30. You can also find the latest results there. We, of course, will have updates throughout the evening here with the results on the bottom of your screen. Then join us on Fox 43 at 10 and again for WAVY News 10 at 11. Our next update is right before the top of the hour. I will see you then. Meantime, it's back to New York for more national coverage from NBC News.
Welcome back to your local election headquarters on WAVY.com. This is Tom Shad along with Dr. Ben Molesky, political science professor at Old Dominion University and our political analysts. And as we had a little break here in the studio, just got a bulletin in from Newport News. Philip Jones has won that mayoral contest over, I think, 3 other candidates. We have Dave Jenkins, Tina Vick, and Sandra Cherry. It looks like it's Jones handily won this race. Brett Hall is with this particular campaign, and he just gave us that information a short time ago. Jones, I believe, raised $200,000.
$221,000.
$221,000, the most ever for that office.
Yeah, and if we put this into comparison, Dave Jenkins only raised about $30,000, Sandra Cherry $50,000, and Tina Vick $24,000. So you add those all together, and he out fundraised everybody by significant portions.
And a local race, that really matters, doesn't it?
Yes. I mean, so this is, it's an interesting race. I mean, it's an open seat race. It's, you know, Dr. McKinley Price has decided to retire. So open seat races garner a lot of attention, right? It's a chance for somebody to make a name for themselves. And this is a really interesting race. I mean, you had Vick, Cherry, and Jenkins, who are city council members. They have the name recognition. They're effectively incumbents, right? And then you have basically a political outsider, Philip Jones, who's a Marine Corps veteran, come into this race, raise a lot of money, and also generate a lot of enthusiasm.
And we just got some information, too, from the Luria Kiggins race before. I know we had a little local break on WAVY TV. Chris Horn, of course, reporting with Lane Luria and Andy Fox with Jen Kiggins. And I think Andy raised a really interesting point that Luria said to Andy yesterday, it was a fine run while it lasted. Interesting comment, because no one has called this race yet, so I want to make sure that people understand that. But Kiggins, though, has a pretty good lead at this point of the race.
Right, so if you look at some of the VPAP data right now, so 155 out of 223 precincts are reporting. So about 70% of the vote is in the precincts. However, if you look at the early votes, right, only about 10.7% of the early votes are in, right? So there's about just shy of 100,000 early votes that are expected. So even though there's a difference right now, about 16,000 votes between the two candidates, like I said, it's still early, right? There's still a lot of votes out there that need to be counted. That can evaporate very, very quickly when you consider how many early votes are still out there to come in.
And early voting tends to favor Democrats. Got to be careful with that, too, because that's been changing.
Yeah, I mean, typically we think
more people are getting used to that idea of early voting.
Right. I mean, you know, voting by mail has historically favored the Democratic Party, right? But this idea of in-person early voting, right? This is where we're still trying to figure out kind of like who is this going to benefit, right? We know that Republicans like to show up and, you know, especially on election day and vote in person. So what's going to happen when we start to dig into some of these early voting numbers and really see, was it just Democrats who showed up early, or did some Republicans take advantage of it and actually come in and vote early? Or we look in to see kind of what the turnout was on election day and see how the Republicans did as well.
It's interesting. You really, when you listen to the rhetoric that we've seen, and I think we talk about this a lot, we lament about negative campaigning and how that works, and also the electorate, both sides, the right and the left, we're getting more and more and more polarized. The other side is not just someone that we should defeat. The other side is evil.
Right.
And how much of that is having an effect on our politics? And basically, how long can we go running our elections this way?
Yeah,
and both sides do it.
Right. I mean, no side is blameless for mudslinging. Both sides have contributed to political polarization, right? And we tend to look at these candidates, right? And we say, oh, the parties in Congress are so polarized today, but at the same time, what has it done to the American electorate, right? It trickles down to us at some point too, right? And you look at this in social media, right? You have the ability on choose your social media platform. You can mute people, you can unfollow, unfriend people, right? So you effectively start to filter out information you don't want to hear, right? You cut out cross-cutting conversations and you create little echo chambers, and it continues to give you the same information. And it creates almost a very tribal nature in us, right? It plays into human nature, which is that us versus them mentality, right? And this is 100% playing into that. But when we translate it to the point where it's us versus them, and the other side is not just the opponent, but they are something that must be defeated, hurt, killed, violence against them, right? That's when things start to get scary.
We just got a bulletin in from Arkansas. Sarah Huckabee Sanders, former press secretary for Donald Trump, winning the governorship in Arkansas. This is from the Associated Press, projecting Sarah Huckabee Sanders the winner, first female governor in Arkansas. Yes. Being a very red state, that should not surprise anybody, though, that Huckabee Sanders won that race.
No, but the interesting thing is women running for office in this election cycle.
That's a great topic right there. I mean, a lot of them are.
If we go back to the last election cycle, right, it was women running for Congress, shattering the glass ceiling, seeing record numbers of women who are running for Senate and for Congress that we've never seen before. But in this election cycle, they're not shattering those numbers again. There's still a lot running for Congress. But when you take it down to the gubernatorial and the state legislative levels, this is where we're seeing women really start to shine. We're seeing more women running for governor than we've ever seen before. There's potential for more women governors to win than ever before. There's potential in some states that will actually see a woman governor and a woman lieutenant governor for the first time in some states, right?
I think of two off the top of my head. I believe Michigan.
Yep.
We have two candidates there. The Gretchen Whitmer trying to defend her seat against Tudor Dixon.
Yep.
Okay, I had to remember that. And I think Oregon, too.
Yes. Oh, I'm blanking on the names, but...
two women there running for governor. I know I should have this right in front of me.
I know I should do.
What's the name? You can always look it up. But there are just a lot of them, right. and a lot of them running for higher office.
And ultimately, this is, from a Democratic standpoint, this is a good thing, right? We always talk about this thing called the glass ceiling, right? And it's very much, it is a true thing, right? There's very much of women have only been able to rise to a certain point in political office, and there's this metaphysical ceiling in front of them that they can look through and see the office, but they can never quite get there. When that ceiling shatters and you actually see a woman win that office, it does something very powerful for future candidates. Future women candidates look forward and see the race has been won, it can be done, and therefore it actually encourages more women to run for those offices.
And then because of that, does ideology become secondary? Because now we see a lot of Republican women, a lot of women of color who are running as conservatives and Republicans. Is it more about the idea versus the ideology?
So ideology still matters, right? Not to say that it doesn't, right? But the ideas matter also, right? And in particular, ideas or specific issues win races, right? So we're seeing, in particular, women of color run for office, and they're taking issues that resonate with the voter that maybe were handled by one party or handled poorly by one party, and they're using that as their foundation, and they're running on that, as opposed to just running on that descriptive difference that I am a woman of color, right, or I am a woman more generally. Now they're running as I am a Republican focused on the issue of education. I'm a woman focused on the issue of the economy and dinner table issues, right? So these are the things that they can run under the Republican brand. And that's also to say, the Republican Party is doing much better in terms of motivating and mobilizing these candidates. They're going out there, they're helping to essentially stroke the progressive ambition of most political candidates, right? To support them with money and resources and logistics, right? And create them a viable path to the office.
And two more quick mentions here. Just got some more bulletins. Maura Healey, while we're talking about someone who identifies with being openly gay, the first openly gay governor in Massachusetts, projected winner tonight from the Associated Press, Democrat, and also Martin Thomas, Norfolk City Council, just declared the winner there. So these results now trickling in. As we see, that's Ward 1. So that was Norfolk City Council is a pretty closely watched race too, like our local races. But I know we've gotten so much on the big congressional races, flipping Congress, that we've heard about so much over the past several months. And it looks like, from what we're seeing, how would you describe the trend? Is it happening? Even though we haven't gotten final numbers, I mean, how are you detecting the wave, if you will?
Yeah, it's still early, right? I mean, we still have states that are closing across the country, right? But if you're the Republicans, you're looking forward here, and you're seeing those magical marks, right? 218 seats in the House, 50 seats in the Senate, and you're looking at these competitive elections, right? And right now, based upon some of the projections, Republicans have picked up 3 seats in the House, right? They're doing well on a lot of these other seats. So the pathway there, the trade winds are with them with kind of historical trends for the House. The Senate is fascinating, right? I mean, as we've talked about, there are pathways of how this election could go where you could have a 50-50 split. There's pathways where the Republicans pick up 3 seats. There's pathways where the Democrats hold and pick up 2 seats. So there's still a lot to play out here. But you and I have been talking about this kind of all night, and I love going to. We talk so much about polling, right? What does polling tell us?
Oh, want to make a bet, right?
I was going to say, you want to make a bet? I love looking at the betting markets, right? In particular, we bet on everything in America, right?
We do, and now it's legal in many cases.
Exactly, and there are markets for if you want to bet on elections. And I love looking at this because, again, we are talking about people that in many cases, make their livings off of being risk averse and making, in some cases, risky bets. But you look at these betting markets, places like polymarket.com and predictit.com, and across the board, a lot of these Senate races, the better bet for you is a Republican tonight. I mean, just right now, if you take a state like Pennsylvania, right? This has kind of gone back and forth, right, over the night as kind of like the money line kind of changes, right? Right now it's ticking back towards Democrat John Fetterman, right?
Yeah.
And Oz is kind of a little bit more of a risky bet. Earlier in the night, it was the other way around, right? However, you look into a state like Georgia, right, between Warnock versus Walker, right?
Yeah.
And Walker is still up, right? 54 cents to 46 cents, right? Kind of on the bet, right? And this is the interesting thing is, again, it's putting the kind of the bet or the perspective in the odds or in the hands of the people that look out there. They look for risk, they look for rewards, and some of these are races where they could be, turning out well tonight, at least for them.
I just got something in my mind. We talked about Pennsylvania, and we talked about there was a Supreme Court ruling, a state Supreme Court ruling that came down that said that if your mail-in ballot's not dated, it will not count. There are some 200,000, I believe, in Pennsylvania that do fit that description. Fetterman's campaign is suing to try to get that overturned. This is a state where we could be languishing, depending how close it is tonight. When does there come a point when we have all these different rules for early voting, for mail-in voting? We have the most advanced technology in the world. Why can't we have both? The convenience and, of course, the able to project a winner the same day as the election like we did 50 years ago. When are we going to be able to reach that particular plateau?
There's a couple of reasons, right? I mean, so one is technology, right? With technology, right, it allows us to scale. Like you'll see a lot of people saying, well, for 200 years we had elections done on paper and we knew on election night it was perfectly fine. But then again, we're talking about like hundreds of thousands scaling up to,
Sure.
millions upon millions now, right? So technology allows us to scale, but technology is not infallible, right? We've seen this across the country today. There have been some precincts that have either, they've had some kind of printer issues. You look at some of the precincts in, say, like Philadelphia, where they're not actually allowed to essentially start tabulating or essentially reporting out until they've actually met the voter what's the word I'm looking for? The roster of essentially all of the voters versus those that also cast in mail-in balloting to make sure that they're copacetic with one another.
Yes, of course.
We've seen this in some places where the voter rolls at the precinct, right? They go down, and we don't know if you are actually registered to vote there, or if you've registered, or it's saying you voted before, right? So there's the technology component to this that very much causes complications, and then there's federalism. Right? We leave it up to every individual state to determine how to essentially conduct their elections.
And see, the downside of all this, not being able to tabulate the night of, when we hear these reports, people who are skeptics or people who can be election deniers say, here we go again. Why should I believe what comes out of the government? It foments these types of conspiracy theories, and is that good for the election process?
No, I mean, if you go back to the last several election cycles, right, this has become kind of a trend, right? And like we've got this technology. Pennsylvania, perfect example of this, just a couple of weeks ago, right after the senatorial debate between Fetterman and Oz, the Secretary of State came out and basically said, expect delays in the Pennsylvania results. So this was, 2 weeks ago. And all it does is plant a seed in the mind of some of the electorate saying, all right, there's potential for shenanigans to take place. There's potential for, you know, my vote not to matter, or to have kind of midnight votes kind of dropped in there. But the reality is it's a very hard sell to those people when you say, you know, our election system is secure, you know, there's integrity to the system. We look at the exit polling tonight, and that was one of the questions that's being asked across the country, right?
Yes.
Like, how do you feel about the elections? And the vast majority of people are saying they're satisfied and it's secure, right? But how do you convince those people?
And even if there's a sizable minority who have a problem, doubt, look what happened January 6th.
Yeah.
Once again. And we don't have to sacrifice federalism for having good, efficient elections if state governments are able to function in that, you know, productive way. So,
but the hard part is because of federalism, getting the state legislatures to move in that direction, and governors to move in that direction as well. I mean, I keep going back to Pennsylvania, my home state, right? And
my home state too.
And it's going to have a lot of focus in, you know, in the coming days. But you look at the fact that, all right, we had this early voting taking place, or mail-in voting taking place in Pennsylvania, but the precincts themselves are not allowed to process the ballots, right? So open them up, ensure that the person, you know, is valid and registered, cast through. They can't do that until the polls have closed, right? Whereas other states have allowed the precincts leading up to the polls closing to get things ready, not tabulating, right, or releasing those votes out.
Understood.
It's just getting things ready. And in Pennsylvania, the state legislature they've kind of drug their heels on this, and that is a rule that could be changed, but the legislature hasn't.
Catch-22, elections do have consequences. You have to vote for people who are going to be able to make these things work, and of course we have to go by what people decide in the legislature, because that's our system of government. It's a messy process.
It is, and I mean, if there was a way to kind of one-size-fits-all it, you know, I would be significantly more famous and richer than I am, but I mean...
A lot of people would be nervous about that too, wouldn't they?
Yes.
A one-size-fits-all, one central way of doing it. There are definite downsides to that as well.
Right. But I mean, there is something goes back to the heart of kind of American federalism, American individualism, that we do want our individual states to be in charge of these things, right? We trust our state governments more than we do the federal government.
Government closest to the people.
Exactly, right? It knows what the people want, right? It matches our political cultures, right? Things like that. And there is something very powerful to the state having control of it, and that gives us maybe better feelings of integrity of the elections when you know your state's the one doing it, as opposed to perhaps the federal government doing it, right? Where we look at inefficiencies across the board in things like the VA, or inefficiencies in reporting for things like Department of Education, et cetera.
Sure.
Right?
So let's see, where are we at right now? I mean, we're having this great discussion. I want to make sure that we're not missing anything as far as our trend. We have a few minutes left, and I wanted to see where we were at about 8:50 tonight. The polls closed in Virginia less than 2 hours ago, and they closed in North Carolina at 7:30.
Yep.
So does it look like a Republican night so far? Still too early to tell.
Still too early to tell, but I mean, close to home. I think the races that people are interested in, you know, the Lori race and the Spanberger race, right? I mean, congressional district number 2, right? We're looking at this right now, 76% reporting by VPAP right now. So that's, you know, or now 80%. I'm sorry, with the refresh now. We're seeing essentially Kiggins 55.7 to that 44.1. So a difference. She's grown her lead now from about that 16,000 to about 19.4. And again, there still is, you know, 90-ish% of the early vote to come in still, right?
Right.
But that's a race that if you're Kiggins, you know, you're looking at the margins for the, you know, what you're seeing right now, and that's what you want, right? And then again, the Spanberger race, the 7th, which again, this was a district that is democratically favored, right, post-redistricting, and it's narrowed up a little bit more now, right? 51.58 to 48.23, with 89% of the precincts reporting.
Okay, narrowed up, but interesting.
But there still is about 35% of the early votes still outstanding, so about you know, 30,000 votes still out there. So there's only a difference of about 7,000 plus votes between them. That could be wiped out very quickly.
Close enough to say, hang on.
Hang on, right? So
hang on a moment.
And then when we kind of think about what this is doing then for kind of like the elections across the board, right? You know, we're still waiting on a lot of these races to be called, right? But you know, the Republicans, they're feeling good tonight, right? But for some of these Democrats, maybe you're looking at this and saying, all right, there's a lot of these votes still in the early voting that are out there. perhaps the bleeding won't be as bad, right? Maybe you couldn't hold the House, but you kept the gains to lower than kind of the average gains for a president in a midterm election.
And that's how you'll be looking at it the next day, if that is the case.
Very much so.
Okay, we have a lot more to talk about tonight. We're going to be having WAVY News 10 at 10 on Fox 43, of course, and WAVY News 10 at 11. Hopefully get more results in, more final results. But for now, we are going to take a short break. Your election headquarters on WAVY.com, Tom Shad with Dr. Ben Milusky from ODU, our political analyst. I want to thank you for joining us tonight, and we'll be back with more news at 10 o'clock on Fox 43.
I forgot all about that. Yeah, I'm off the
Results have to be officially filed for this year's election. Just check for updates on air and online as we wait for these races here in the city of Norfolk to be called. Live tonight in Norfolk, I'm John Dowding, 10 on your side.
All right, thanks for the update, John. Let's jump over now to 10 on your side's Kiana Patterson in Portsmouth. Kiana, Portsmouth City Council is always an interesting race to watch.
Oh yes, people we spoke with today say that they want to see change within the leadership, and that's following some recent drama here in the city. There was a $5 million lawsuit filed by the former city manager and a letter filed by the current city manager alleging that a few members on council are causing some disruption. So people want to see change, and we know about 13,000 voters showed up today, and 4,000 early voters have already cast their ballots. 3 city council seats are up right now, and 11 candidates are on the ballot. Right now, the unofficial results show Mark Hugel, Vernon Tillage, and Bill Moody are in the lead right now for those city council seats. And we also know there are 4 school board seats up for grabs as well. So we're continuing to follow those results, and we'll have more updates for you guys coming up a little later. In Portsmouth, Kiana Patterson, 10 on your side.
Kiana, thank you. Our live local coverage continues in just a moment over on WAVY.com, and that goes until 9:30 tonight. You can also find the latest results there, and we'll have updates throughout the evening here with the results on the bottom of your screen. Then join us on Fox 43 at 10 and again for WAVY News 10 at 11. Our next update is coming up in about 30 minutes. We'll see you then. Meantime, it's back to New York for more national coverage from NBC News.
And our election coverage continues here online, WAVY.com, Facebook, and YouTube. I'm Nathan Epstein, joined by Ben Professor at ODU, and our wonderful producer, Sarah Good, trying to get everything going here. And we appreciate you for joining us on our election coverage as we keep our eye on what's going on nationally. I know that everyone watching has a lot of interest here in Virginia. We've been keeping our eye on the 2nd District, on the 7th District, on the 10th District, and actually we've been talking a lot while we've been trying to get things up and running here. And so far, we've seen sizable leads for Kiggins over Loria, but you say that obviously it ain't over till it's over.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at VPAP, that tends to be kind of my source for Virginia elections. And one of the things I love is that they kind of break it down in terms of what the precincts are at, and then we have this basket of early votes, right, that was being processed and being kind of reported out. So right now, 198 of the 223 precincts in the second are reporting, so 88.8%, right? And there's a difference of just shy of 20,000 votes between Kiggins and Loria in favor of Kiggins. However, there still is like 78% of the early votes that are out there, right? That's about almost 80,000 votes, right? Or sorry, 70,000 votes, sorry. So that difference could evaporate very quickly, right? You know, depending who voted early, what the composition is, who they were in favor of. But still, Elaine Loria is, you know, looking at these, and Kiggins is looking at them pretty happy, at least in terms of that margin where she's at from the precincts.
And we have our results up here, so anybody watching can keep up as we continue our discussions here. But I want to go back to early voting for a second there, because we were talking about it a little bit a few minutes ago. What's interesting has been these trends that we've seen all night long. Based on the polling, we've seen Republicans with sizable advantages, and we thought that based on what we've seen previous years with early voting, or with day of voting, I should say, that we would see early bumps in Republican leads in many of these Senate races all over the country. We're looking at Georgia, North Carolina, Ohio, Pennsylvania, New Hampshire. Those are the big ones that we're keeping an eye on right now. But we really haven't seen that. We really, honestly, have seen the opposite. We've seen Democrats starting off with big leads and Republicans having to catch up.
And I think part of this really plays into just how important the Senate races are, right? It comes down to just the slimmest of margins, right? Winning that one seat effectively. And every race is a battleground, right? And obviously some races have attracted more attention and more money, but some of these races, which you would think maybe would have been a runaway, there really were no runaways, with maybe the exception of the Florida Rubio's race, right? And I think there's a lot to this, right? So we're going to have to really dive into, especially in the postmortem after the election, to see who was turning out early, who was voting by mail, and then on election day, right, looking into who actually was coming out, right? So we're seeing reports in some states that youth vote was massive. I mean, I messaged one of my buddies this out in Wisconsin, and it was reported in a tweet earlier, but it was from the Courier newsroom. In Wisconsin, the youth vote is 360% bigger compared to 2018. The black vote is 123% bigger compared to 2018. And the female vote, the woman's vote, is 137% bigger.
Wow.
Right? I mean, those are massive numbers, right? So we're going to have to really dive into some of these states to really see who is turning out and voting.
I heard someone say a while ago that politics is supposed to be boring.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, but do you think that maybe the rhetoric that we've seen over the past year, I heard you and Tom Shad talking about it a little while ago, that the rhetoric it's not just about who is wrong and who is right now. It's about who is evil and who is not, and that's unfortunate. But do you think that kind of rhetoric is what led to a spike in voting as far as the younger demographics go?
To an extent, right? I mean, so there very much is something to talk about in terms of this rhetoric is pushing us so far apart. Right? This idea of polarization, of tribalism, right? Us versus them. But I think it's also, there is something to, we're seeing young people today, in particular young people that are maybe starting to move a little bit up older, right? Some of those kind of millennials they've moved into kind of that political adulthood, right? And they're taking advantage of this, because for the longest time they were either told the youth vote doesn't matter, it doesn't vote,
right?
And policy issues, right, are always directed to the elderly and not to them, right? And then they're starting to see things like economic recessions, tuition, right, increases, student debt, right? So these are things that impact them, right? I mean, especially so many generations are coming out into significant recessions, right, and trying to find jobs, right? So I think we're seeing a lot of younger people kind of moving into political adulthood. And then also the campaigns themselves are starting to target young voters better, right? We're changing, it's not just ads on television and yard signs anymore, but it's also what's going on social media, right? Some of the best campaigns have significant social media campaigns. I mean, look at the Fetterman campaign. It was phenomenal in terms of what it did for social media and attracting young people to go vote.
So speaking of, we're going to kind of recap here. We're going to get everybody up to speed with what's going on here nationally. So Ben, you and I, let's keep an eye on the Senate races here because obviously the balance of power is at stake right now. A couple of things that we are looking at, Georgia, North Carolina, Ohio. We were talking about this a little while ago, that one of the early surprises was Bud in North Carolina taking on Beasley, and Bud had been polling pretty much an average of about 4.5 point lead for the last month and a half. That was about the size of his lead, and he started off 10 points behind to start the night. So that's kind of one of those interesting trends that we saw earlier.
Yeah. So North Carolina is interesting unto itself because it's an open seat election.
Yeah, no, we're still working. We're still working here. We're
still learning the things.
Yeah.
So Richard Burr retired, right, and left an open seat election, and therefore open seat elections attract a lot of attention, right? There's no incumbent on the ballot, so it allows for potential for challengers to get in there, get the name recognition, and fight, right? You're not David fighting Goliath here trying to take down a juggernaut. So, Bud versus Beasley, right, was this open seat election where, at least according to Real Clear Politics, right, the average poll of polls was actually 6.2% in favor of Bud, right? So that was a sizable...
outside the margin of error, yeah.
Outside the margin of error, right? And then we started the night off with Beasley essentially up, right? But then right now we're at about 69% of the vote is in, right? There's still, again, a lot still out there, but we're seeing Bud start to creep away, right? He's now up by about 21,000 votes, but that, again, could change as the night rolls around. We get these pockets of votes as precincts report in chunks, right? And that's something that all voters and viewers should understand, is that it's not just it all comes in at once and, we hit a button and it all tabulates. States, this is both the beauty and the curse of federalism, right? Is that states are allowed to do things on their own ways, and then within the states, we allow precincts to do things in their own ways. I mean, I think back to my home state of Pennsylvania, and I mean, some precincts are still reporting via fax. I mean, it's...
Are you kidding me?
Yeah.
We're sitting here talking on YouTube and Facebook, and people are still reporting by fax.
Yeah,
okay.
I mean, so it's very much, right? I mean, there's fax call-ins, right? There's this trickle of votes that come in, right? So it's not nefarious. It's not that this was concocted. It's just how the system historically has worked, and it's a big leviathan. I mean, it's a mess.
Sarah has just given us an update here, and not so much a surprise here. Greg Abbott is projected to be the winner in the Texas gubernatorial race over Beto O'Rourke. This is the second time that Beto has run for high office in Texas, and what's amazing is I think I saw somewhere today that Beto has spent somewhere in the neighborhood of, what was the number they said, $100 million over his past 2 election cycles.
Yeah.
And but Greg Abbott, again, projected the winner in the Texas gubernatorial race.
And that's to be expected. I mean, obviously, if you kind of go back to the polling, in the weeks leading up to election, Beto did make a rush, right? I mean, the polls narrowed somewhat, right?
Yeah.
But as we got closer to the election event, Abbott pulled away. And we're seeing exactly what you would expect there. But this is showing us kind of that Texas is changing, right? I mean, it's like to expect that suddenly, like we flipped a light switch and Texas becomes a blue state tonight. I think given the general trends that we're seeing across the country in terms of how Republicans are doing, that's a bit outside of the not the realm of possibility, but likelihoods, right? But as we move forward, this is showing us that Texas is changing a little bit, right?
Very much so.
The fact that a candidate like Beto O'Rourke could get such traction, right? We're seeing a lot of migration into Texas, right? I mean, look at states that are losing population, California, Colorado, right? Some of the western states. And where are they going? They're going to states like Texas.
They're going to Texas,
And just even if they, you're getting some people are moving, they're naturally more liberal than, because they're coming from a state like Colorado or California. And that's naturally, think about it like if you had a glass of water, right? And you had like all the red food coloring in it, and you just slowly take your blue food coloring and just drop by drop by drop, right? What's going to happen? Over time, that's going to turn purple and slowly change, right? And as the migration occurs, right, into the suburbs and into the cities, Texas is changing, right? But it still has that deep red streak that, you can't just obliterate in one election cycle.
Well, and we're starting to see more of that change, really. And look, there's such a big difference between the midterm elections and the presidential elections, but it's really in the presidential elections where things are getting much, much tighter.
Yes, very much so. And I think it's the scope and the scale of how important a presidential election is, right? That drives, you just look at it in terms of just turnout historically, right? 70-odd%, right, for the presidential elections versus, choose your year for the midterm elections, and you have a significant drop off of 20-30% or even more depending on the year. But a presidential election is that kind of signifier as that is the direct policy change. It's the direction of the country. Not to say that a gubernatorial election is not important, right? But it has the potential, or it doesn't have the potential that a presidential election does to really shift policy on on the national scale, and then what that means for the states.
So, kind of going down the states here as far as the Senate races are concerned, Georgia is one that everyone's keeping their eye on, and that is starting to kind of creep up as far as the tabulations go. We are, according to Real Clear Politics, at 65% reporting, and Raphael Warnock still has a lead over Herschel Walker, 51-47, and that to me has been one of the more interesting national races, simply because you have Raphael Warnock in a state that, by all available polling, suggests that Brian Kemp is going to carry that state over Stacey Abrams. And there have been many who have suggested that maybe Kemp can sort of pull Walker across the finish line. So you don't really have a particularly popular candidate in Warnock, but there have been a lot of flaws with Herschel Walker that people have noticed, and maybe that's why this race is tighter than what most people thought it would at the start.
Yeah, so there's a couple of factors at play here. So one is candidate quality, right? So within the last several weeks, right, there's been several admissions and kind of news stories that have come out about Walker, right? And if you dive into the exit polling, overwhelmingly, the Georgian voter does not view Walker as having essentially good decision-making capabilities, right? Compared to Warnock, who is kind of viewed fairly majority as having that, right? So you had these events kind of come out in terms of that questioned his decision-making ability as it relates to policy stances, abortion, et cetera, and it happened close to the election cycle. So there wasn't a lot of time for this to kind of drip away and kind of drift away as we, something like Roe v. Wade, kind of more generally, right? This happened very close to the election event. And in terms of what we're seeing here, right, you also have a third-party candidate here that's kind of sucking up some votes, right? So Oliver, at least with 66% now in, has 1.8% of the vote, right? So are these people that are voting for the libertarian candidate, right? So if we think about kind of like political ideology, right? Libertarians kind of get you closer to the center, right, on some issues, and, to the right on others, right? So are there some conservative Republicans that took a look at Walker and said, well, based upon the things that have come out recently, based upon candidate quality here, I can't hold my nose to him, right? I can vote for Kemp, I can split my ticket, right? I can vote for Kemp, but I can't do it for Walker, but I have a substitution here. I can vote for Oliver, essentially vote my displeasure.
And ticket splitting is not uncommon per se, but we've seen more of it in the past election cycles. What some would suggest happened with Donald Trump in the last election, where he performed very poorly in the presidential election, but down ballot, Republicans almost outperformed.
Right. Historically, we've seen split ticketing start to drip away, right, in terms of some states still have straight ticket voting in effect, right? But we're actually now seeing some people, as straight ticket voting has disappeared, splitting their ticket. They'll choose somebody at the top of the ticket for one, maybe a governor or a president, right? But then as you move down the ballot, you'll choose the others. And this may be very well what we're seeing here in Georgia, is that Kemp is going to handily beat Stacey Abrams. But because of all these factors we talked about with Walker, there's going to be this ticket split.
And we've gotten two more election results that you can find on WAVY.com and our Twitter page on for WAVY, and that is Republican Rob Whitman and Democrat Don McEachin have each won their races.
Yeah. So to essentially be expected. Right?
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
So
So like they're not key races, but at the end of the day, like every race kind of matters here, right? But it's not outside of what we were expecting.
Right. So we're going to actually go back to your home state for a second, as you've been apt to do most of the night, understandably so. And hey, Pennsylvania has been a huge topic of conversation, not only all day, all night, but it's probably going to be for the next few weeks. As of right now, we are still, I don't even want to mention the percentage because it's so early, but Fetterman has a sizable lead over Mehmet Oz. What are some of the things that you have noticed in the trends, really? People can go back to that debate, but even before that, it seemed like Oz was sort of maybe catching a little bit of a momentum, and, you know, it's been a dead heat virtually for the last 2 weeks.
Yeah, I mean, leading into the election, Fetterman really drove this message that Oz wasn't one of us, right?
Yes.
So, I mean, it was
going back to candidate quality.
Candidate quality, right? So Oz wasn't one of us. He's a New Jerseyan, right? And as being a Pennsylvanian myself, there is that rivalry between Pennsylvania and New Jersey, right?
It's like
so,
you can be from anywhere, maybe not from New Jersey.
Right. And I mean, if you want to give props to anyone in this campaign, look at Fetterman's social media manager. Just for fun, dive back into the social media of the Fetterman campaign.
Over the summer, it was spectacular.
Phenomenal. Yes. But then as we get closer to the election event, right? So now kind of the issues that we start to think about, right? Those dinner table issues, the economy, right? The popularity of Joe Biden, right? These things start to creep into the election cycle, and naturally the polls start to narrow to the point where actually this morning, Fetterman, when asked about kind of how he viewed the election day, said, well, it was a jump ball, right? To give us a nice, sports analogy, as he's known to do during the election was. And I think that was to maybe temper expectations. But what we're starting to see now is when we started to have this conversation earlier, right, only about 9-10% of the vote was in. Again, we're still very early. We're only at 18% now. So a shift about 9 points. But what are we starting to see, right? So Fetterman is at 59.6 and Oz is at 37.9, right? That was, at the start of our conversation, was at about 70 odd compared to 20 odd, right? So it's starting to narrow here as more of the vote comes in. So it's to say that there's still a lot of a race left to be run here as we wait for all the votes to come in tonight into the next potentially couple days, depending.
And going down the list here of some of those states that we're keeping an eye on, Ohio, and that was one that kind of caught my eye at the start. You had J.D. Vance, who you could consider an outsider, I guess, going up against Tim Ryan, an established name in Ohio. And J.D. Vance, again, by all available polling, as a matter of fact, based on the pre-election day polling that I saw, it looked like J.D. Vance was just starting to pull away.
I mean, he had a +8 in the poll of polls leading into this. And, the night hadn't started well for him.
No, I mean, J.D. Vance, he has a lead. The early part of the night, it was Ryan pretty much all the way up until we're now at, it says 49%, reporting, and Vance is at not even a point. Right.
I mean, we're well within kind of that, potential for a recount, essentially, if you want to, we won't even start talking recounts because, I mean, that's, but this is, if we think about this, a lot of these elections, there's polling, right? And then there's internal polling, and then there's just election day events, right? Who actually turns out on election day? Mm-hmm. And they don't always line up, right? I mean, there's a lot of conversations, moving forward since 2016 in terms of polling, the accuracy of it, the quality of the polls. There's so many more polling firms that have gotten into the game recently, especially in races that get a lot of attention. So there's quality of poll issues, but it's to say is that so many of these races, they matter, and so many of them actually are on razor's edge.
And another race that sort of reappeared on the map was New Hampshire. Yeah. Nobody had New Hampshire as anywhere near Republican territory over the summer, and all of a sudden Bulldog makes this charge at the end of the fall. How did you see that one coming along?
I mean, that was one where, if you want to talk about kind of like splitting your ticket again, right? I mean, if you kind of look at the governor's race for New Hampshire right now, where's my results here? Here we are. All over the place here.
It's typical for election night.
I know, it's trying to do touchscreens, but I mean, effectively, this was one where Hassan is the independent, right? That's the expectation is should do well, but then you have Bulldog, who came forward and really spoke economic issues from the last really 3.5 weeks forward. Was kind of a blitzkrieg on that, and frankly, you expect it as those polls started to shrink. I mean, I think I had kind of the poll of polls up here for New Hampshire, and they were kind of back and forth, right?
Mm-hmm.
And finally, like it kind of came down and was like, well, Hassan's only at 1.4, polling at 1.4% better than Bodok, right? So, like New Hampshire of all places, like why is this kind of like coming up? But again, it's every single race matters here, right? And it's a mobilization factor, right?
Yeah.
So if you're in a state where you're like, well, it shouldn't matter, right? But I'm hearing like, okay, all we need is one seat to take control here, or this is the, vote for your rights, or this is the election to end all elections.
The election to end all elections,
right?
yeah.
You say, okay, well, maybe I'll go vote, right? So we're gonna have to really again dive into these exit polls. We're gonna have to dive into the postmortem after the election, and really to see who came out and voted. And frankly, we're leading into that this really could be people that don't typically turn out to vote or didn't really think that their vote would matter coming out and voting.
No surprise, the only result, the only Senate race that has already been called, at least by the Associated Press, was Marco Rubio over Val Demings. And not really a surprise, but when diving into the numbers, we were actually looking also at Ron DeSantis, how his race was called over Christ. And that one, I mean, Ron DeSantis, he won that one almost an hour after the polls closed. I
mean, it was basically like, how fast can you on the networks run to like, call your declaration here. But I mean, you look at, with 88% of the vote in, right? I mean, he's got 59.3 to 40.1 over Chris. And I was talking to a buddy down in Florida this morning, and, we were having a conversation like, was Chris the best candidate? And me looking at this as the political outsider from Florida said, well, I mean, former governor, right? He has the name recognition, he can attract some money. And then my colleague down in Florida was saying, well, there is something to Christ in terms of he was kind of the Aaron Burr of the election, where he flip-flopped on a lot of things and he never really took a stance on other issues. And there's something very powerful to that if people don't know who you are, right, where you stand on things, to the point where we're actually having a conversation of looking into his judges during the Christ administration in terms of like, well, are they a Republican? Are they a Democrat? Like Christ appointed them, we don't know, right? So it kind of like almost taints even judicial candidates. So looking into how DeSantis beat Christ and how handily he beat Christ, that's fascinating.
Two words that have come up a lot in the last several minutes: Miami-Dade. There is a county that Republicans almost just admitted defeat for most of the last 30, 40 years, and that has flipped in a big way.
This is the first time for Miami-Dade County that a Republican has won it in 20 years. I mean, that is fascinating, right? So this really goes to show you that DeSantis as a candidate is strong. And not to say that also, Chris kind of narrowed it a little bit as we came closer in the polling, but DeSantis also benefited from Hurricane Ian. I mean, I was talking on the earlier broadcast about this, was that when natural disasters happen,
yes,
you look to the top of the food chain.
Yes.
In particular, in the state, you look to the governor for leadership.
Mm-hmm.
And he did well in the fallout of Hurricane Ian in terms of supplies, resources, troops, emergency declarations ready to go. And he literally has kind of the Hurricane Ian trade winds at his back here.
Well, and, the last thing, when I think about that, I think about Superstorm Sandy,
Mm-hmm.
and when it hit, the northeastern part of the country, and who benefited from that was actually Barack Obama, because he was the first one up there, and actually everyone was criticizing Chris Christie because he was maybe, I can't remember, was he running for president at that time?
So I'm trying to remember the year.
That was, I think, 2012. Well, so it was Romney was the nominee, but
he ran in that cycle too.
I think he ran in that cycle. I think it was somewhere around that time, but I think really it was more so just a momentum. Superstorm Sandy happened in the fall,
right?
And it was just more of an image thing, that Romney kind of couldn't afford at that time. But that's what this. You're right about when natural disasters happen, they sort of benefit the top of the food chain,
right? And I mean, the reality is, like, if you're betting, you look at this.
Yep,
this
you talked about that with Tom Shad.
Right,
yep.
I mean, you look at this gap between DeSantis and Chris, and you say, all right, if he can win Miami-Dade for the first time in 20 years and beat his competition by, almost 20 points, or effectively almost 20 points here, is he going to run in 2024?
I want to bring Sarah Gooden here for a second.
Yes.
So do we have any updates worth mentioning right now?
We have a few updates I'm waiting on, but one question from viewers that I do think is important for people to understand is how have races been called when mail-in votes haven't been counted? And I think, a lot of people are waiting for results around the country. How did those fit in? Can you just give an explainer on that?
Yeah, so when we think about this, we look at essentially votes that have come in terms of the precinct voting, day of voting, right? And we look to see what the margins are in terms of between the candidates, right? And if there's a sizable kind of margin. And then we look to see essentially how many votes are still outstanding there. I've talked about this in like the 2nd and the 7th, right? Like this early vote, like how many votes are still left out there. And then we look to see essentially of those early votes, right, how they were kind of broken down as well too. And the expectation is, all right, those margins in the early voting, are they going to hold, and are they kind of big enough that could allow one candidate, if they're essentially benefiting in the early vote but they're behind in the precinct voting, could allow them to overcome that? Or vice versa, if they're winning in the precinct voting and then you look to see how many votes are left in the early vote or in the mail-in voting, right, and the margins that essentially are showing in that, is there potential, is there a pathway forward that if those margins hold, that the opposition could win or overtake them?
In what states is mail-in votes, where is that really going to be an issue that, constituents are going to have to look for that?
I mean, so keep, Pennsylvania, right? I mean,
Yep.
You have to hear me say this. And it all goes back to, as we were talking about federalism, the fact that Pennsylvania, their state legislature basically said that the precincts are not allowed to actually start processing mail-in votes until the polls had closed in Pennsylvania. So we're talking, hundreds of thousands of votes that are just sitting out there, and they can't. When we talk about processing, also, it means that essentially we take your ballot in, we look to see, in terms of the envelope and everything that came with it, was it properly done? We look to see, are you registered to vote, right? Is it a valid vote unto itself? And then once all of that's ready, then we can actually kind of run it through and tabulate the votes. But that takes time, right, to open envelopes, to check things out. So for Pennsylvania, you might be thinking about kind of mail-in voting. What's it going to happen here? Well, you have to wait, because then obviously the precincts are busy as all get out with just normal election day voting, and then you throw on top of this mail-in votes on as well, and it's going to slow things down.
Absolutely.
Sarah, I haven't confirmed this yet, so I don't want to put this out as an official an official race that has been called. But I've seen in some places, not unexpectedly, Michael Bennet has held up his seat in Colorado over Joe O'Dea. Which, again, talking about that polling, that was to be expected. I mean, I think the margin for Bennet was somewhere in the neighborhood of 7-8 points over the last several weeks, but Bennett, at least that's what I'm seeing right now.
NBC News is reporting. Yes.
Okay, so Michael Bennet has held that spot over Joe O'Dea.
Yeah, I mean, so to be expected. I don't have my poll of polls here for that, but I mean, leading up to this, from what I'm remembering off, it was definitely trending by a fairly sizable margin in the last several weeks leading into it.
And I know we don't have a whole lot of time here, Sarah. I know that we're at some point here going to switch over. Our on-air coverage is going to continue on Fox 43. But one state we have not talked about, and rightfully so, because I think the polls just closed, I think something like 25 minutes ago, is Arizona. And Arizona is another one of those crucial battleground states where we're looking at Blake Masters and Mark Kelly, and that is one where really another race where Mark Kelly a month and a half ago had a very comfortable lead, maybe just outside of the margin of error, about 4.5–5%, and now it's been a dead heat the last 2-3 weeks.
100% razor's edge there. But again, think about this. This is a state that Joe Biden won by 0.3% in 2020, right? And further, if you go back to the 2 Senate elections before this, right, they were only decided by 2.4%, right? So there's not a lot of wiggle room to start here for Kelly to essentially be running away with it by any means. So this is going to be one of those races where we're going to have to kind of sit and wait a little bit.
A couple of other races that are starting to near the finish. Obviously, this is going to be a long night and a long few weeks ahead, but Bud is starting to pull ahead of Sherry Beasley in North Carolina, 55.5% to 47.5%, 7.5% reporting. J.D. Vance and Tim Ryan still very, very close, but Vance is slightly ahead in Ohio. And your home state, Pennsylvania, still very, very early, but 27% reporting. Fetterman was, I think the word we used when they first opened up the results was walloping helping Mehmet Oz, but again, that was with only about 8-9% reporting. And now Fetterman is up 56 to 41. That's with only 27% reporting. So that one we expect to get tighter and tighter.
Yeah,
and
I mean, it just updated 29%, 55.4 to 42%. So it's just going to keep going like this as the night comes along. But for these races, North Carolina, Ohio, right? Those are races that the Republicans, they need to win this,
They need
right?
to, yeah.
And if you're looking to see kind of how the trends are going now, you're feeling better about this, right? But you're not ready to pop the champagne yet and go. And then you're looking around the country. You're looking at Pennsylvania. You're looking at Georgia still, right? You're hoping for Georgia, right? I mean, and that, in just the last several minutes here, that's narrowed up as well as again too, right? In Georgia, 72% in, Warnock at 49.5 to Walker 48.6, right? So it's, you're looking around the country, and then you're looking to a state like Nevada, and you're
that one's an interesting one because the polling suggested that Laxalt was starting to pull away in that race, but now there have been several pollsters who've actually said that they believe Masto is going to pull this one out.
Yeah, I mean, so the polling had kind of Laxalt at about, the poll of polls had about 3.4%, but that was in the last couple weeks, just kind of this sprint towards the finish line. So Nevada's an interesting state in terms of, we think about the demographics of the population, we think about how Biden did there in 2020, right? So it's one of those where Masto, as the incumbent, should win this, right? But Laxalt is going to give a run for the money.
And we have another update from Sarah, who is saying that News Nation is reporting that, not unexpectedly, Brian Kemp is projected to win the governor's race in Georgia. We'll have to see what the after effect of that is, assuming that this race continues to tighten up in Georgia between Warnock and Walker.
Yeah, I mean that race. I mean, so this is one of those. There's a third party candidate in the gubernatorial side as well too, Hazel on the Libertarian, right? But you look at the difference there, right? Only picking up about 0.6% of the vote compared to that 1 point odd, for Oliver, right? So Kemp is very much, pulled ahead here by a fairly significant margin. Again, defeating Stacey Abrams it's potentially going to be a larger margin this time around than the last election cycle. But was Kemp able to pull Herschel Walker across the finish line? We don't know. We still have to wait as more of these precincts continue to drop in.
And I'm sure the one thing that everyone is looking forward to is a month longer of election night, considering the rule in Georgia, which is if you don't get 50% of the vote, you go into a runoff, which is not going to be until the beginning of December.
Yes, December 6th, right? So again, this is the beauty and the curse of the heterogeneity of our states, right? The state rules such that, if you don't get that majority, we will see you December 6th, right? So, and that's why, as you're the Republicans and you're looking around, at all these different races, like can we hold here? Can we win here, right? There's a pathway where, depending how everything shakes out, it could still be 50-50, and we're waiting for Georgia till the 6th of January.
Till the 6th of January. Yeah, please, not the 6th of January. A month is long enough. There is one, as we're winding down here, there is one gubernatorial race that we haven't mentioned, and because there's no numbers to crunch just yet, but the most interesting one is probably Carrie Lake versus Katie Hobbs in Arizona. Carrie Lake has, agree or disagree with her policies, it seems to me like she's run a masterful campaign and has really, the golden rule in politics is you got to put your opponent on the defensive, and she has done nothing but that over the last several months.
Right. I mean, if you look at this morning, she had kind of a little kind of press conference on the fly, and she literally said to the media, look, I'm coming for you, right? This is how I run a campaign. This is how it's going to be. And she even, was kind of bold in saying this will be for 8 years. Right?
Yeah, she really did. I mean, there's been all this talk about if she wins, is she going to run for president in 2024? And if she doesn't, is she going to be a running mate for Donald Trump if he does run again, which by all accounts it seems like he might announce. But there's all those questions about something that will pull her away from the governorship. But like you said, she held that press conference this morning, and she basically said, this is going to be it for 8 years.
No, and I mean, going into this election, I mean, she was up by 3.5% across the polls. I mean, so it's going to be a close race, and obviously we don't really have anything on this yet, right? But she's feeling confident, and either that's candidate kind of like presenting an air of confidence, right, or that's just kind of general confidence from internal polling that you've got.
So as we wind things down here, any surprise? I mean, we've been going through a lot of these numbers, and not many surprises as of so far. I mean, again, we're still keeping our eye. Do we have an update on Loria and Kiggins in the 2nd District?
Pull it up real quick here.
Yeah, here, I'll pull it up on the screen
perfect.
for us too, so we can all take a look. here's what we have right now. It's still 55.4% for Kiggins and 44.6% for Luria.
Right, so that's with, what, 46% of vote in. VPAP is reporting 96% of the vote in.
Okay.
And again, differences between our reporting and VPAP, but it's about a 22,000 vote lead. There's still about 57% of the early votes that are still kind of hanging out there, right? But if you're the Kiggins campaign, you're feeling good, right?
Feeling good.
You're growing your margin, right? So it's like if you were Kiggins and you're seeing these numbers come in and your margin between the two is starting to shrink, that's when you worry.
Mm-hmm.
But over our last half an hour here, as we've been discussing this, right, that number has just continued to tick up for her, right? So she's growing her margin as opposed to watching Luria cut away at it.
Is there anything that you're going to be keeping your eye on? I mean, again, it's always a matter of just following the numbers, but is there anything as far as the balance of power in the Senate that you're going to be keeping your eye on, particularly as we look at Georgia, North Carolina? Again, we've said it so many times, but these races are so razor thin.
They're razor thin, and I mean, frankly, I don't think anyone, you can listen to pundits there, pull up their crystal balls. And the reality is these are such close races that, if anybody wants to go to the bank with it, I wouldn't trust them. However, the only people I would trust, as we've talked about, kind of earlier to this, is look at the betting markets, right? People that are kind of, they are betting on U.S. elections. And I'm interested to see how well those people ended up as the night kind of comes along, right? Did they predict better than even the polls said?
Are there political wise guys, basically?
Well, yeah, I mean, this is their, for many of them, they make a living doing this, right? And could they predict better through betting than even the polls were showing us?
So as of right now, 73% reporting in Georgia, and that is razor thin. Raphael Warnock, 49.5% to Walker's 48.6%. Still a long ways to go in that one. North Carolina, Bud has taken a lead over Sherry Beasley, 50.6 to 47.4%. That with 78% reporting. Ohio, here's an interesting one for you. J.D. Vance is starting to pull away a little bit, and he began the night with a 10-point deficit to Tim Ryan, the established Democrat in Ohio, 53.1 to 46.8%. As that one comes in, and we are continuing to see, for the first time tonight, Mehmet Oz is within 10 points of John Fetterman, who still has a 54.5-point lead with 32%. So it's a long road ahead in that one.
And I would say if you're the Democrats right now, especially with Georgia, your eye is on that, and we keep talking about this runoff, right? You need Warnock to get that majority because you keep going back to this third-party candidate, right? Oliver is sitting there right now at 1.9%. So if you go to the runoff in December, right, where there is no third-party candidate on the ballot, it now is down between the top two vote getters of Warnock and Walker. What happens, right? Where does that 1.9% go if those people turn out and vote in December?
New Hampshire, that is one with Maggie Hassan and Bulldog. Yep. That's, again, one a few months ago that we did not expect to be in the running here, with the Republican in New Hampshire really challenging Hassan, who, like you said, is more of an independent than opposed to a Democrat. But Hassan with 58.3%, Bulldog 40.4% with 34%. Since we have, Sarah, we have a little bit of time here. Is there, a few more minutes here. Are there any questions on the Facebook chat that maybe we might be able to get, if anybody has one, that we might be able to get to with... As we wrap things up here, again, our online and on-air coverage will continue on Fox 43 in just about 10 minutes with Tom Shad and Marilena Baloris, and our coverage continues always on WAVY.com. Ben Molesky's been here with us all night, really putting you to work. Have we worked you enough tonight?
I think so. It's been a fun night, and this is the beauty of being in Virginia, right? We have an election every year here, so
every year
another one's coming around, and literally starting within
I think the big question for Virginia viewers right now is, should they go to sleep and wait till the morning for the results to come in?
I would say if you're really interested in the 2nd or the 7th, yeah, you can stay up a little bit longer, right? But otherwise, I'd say if you're looking to see who's going to win the Senate tonight, go to sleep. Get a good night's sleep. It'll still be here tomorrow.
It'll still be here tomorrow, and it might be here for the next day and the next day and the next day and the next day after that. So, yeah, I heard you talk about, you talked to Tom Shad also about the legal challenges going on in Pennsylvania too, and that could really present a quite a speed bump there.
Yeah, I mean, sizable number of ballots that have come in, and the big thing for the Virginia viewers here that might not be familiar with it is basically when you send in your mail-in ballot, right? There's an internal kind of secrecy envelope, and then there's an external envelope you put it in. On the external, you have to basically sign as well as date. And a Supreme Court ruling, state Supreme Court ruling, ruled 3-3, basically upholding a lower court ruling that if it is incorrectly dated or undated, your vote is invalidated.
And they're challenging that right now. So we'll see exactly where that takes us. We ready to wrap things up here? All right. Well, thank you, Ben, so very much for being here, and appreciate all your insight. And like you said, we are going to be keeping our eyes on this very, very closely tonight, and probably for the next few days, and maybe, hopefully not, the next few weeks. I'm Nathan Epstein. Thank you so much for joining us on Twitter, on YouTube, on Facebook. On our on-air coverage of Election Night 2022 continues on Fox 43 with Tom Shad and Maria Belloris at 10 o'clock.